All right, now that we have finished up our brain candy, we are going to do another half of a slideshow, a lesson today. You can find this lesson on the U.S. History homepage. If you head to the classwork section under week 3, it is titled America in the Early 1800s Slides. If you could open that up, the front cover looks like this. We're going to go through 12 of these slides today, and there is an exit ticket that you will be completing at the end of class related to these slides. On top of that, I want to remind everybody that your presidential poster project is due today at 3:15 p.m. All right. We left off last week. We had discussed the failure of our first national constitution, the Articles of Confederation, as well as the success of the second national constitution, what we today just call the U.S. Constitution. Well, when that occurred in 1789, when it was finally ratified, our new federal government, believe it or not, did not meet in the capital that you know of today. Washington, D.C. did not become the capital of the United States until a few decades after the Constitution was ratified. Instead, the first capital of the United States was actually New York City. This is where Congress met. This is where the president, the first president, George Washington, would be officially elected by the Electoral College. But in the capital, like in any democratic system, there were many differing views. You may recall during the ratification of the Constitution that two factions came about. They were the Federalist faction that wanted to see the passing of a new Constitution, and the Anti-Federalist faction that wanted there to be more protections on states and individual rights. After the ratification, these two factions would actually form the first two political parties in the United States. One of these was the Federalist Party, and this was mostly made up of those that were in the Federalist faction. Some of the head honchos of this group were men like John Adams, men like James Madison, and actually, eventually, George Washington, even though he tried to remain neutral throughout all of this. The Anti-Federalist Party would eventually become known as the Democratic Republican Party. This is not yet the Democratic Party, and it is not yet the Republican Party. And the major split between these two parties in early history is what European superpower they wished for the new America to align with. The Federalists wanted to see us have a stronger trade relationship with the nation that we had fought a revolution against, Great Britain, whereas the Democratic Republicans favored more of an alignment with the French, who had assisted us in defeating the British. Now, once again, the new president, George Washington, he aimed to remain neutral. He wanted to see us continue to trade with both Britain and France. However, by 1793, towards the end of his first presidency, this became almost impossible. And that is because the British were openly attacking and seizing American ships that were seen trading with French colonies. Washington, instead of immediately jumping the gun and going to war, sent an emissary, somebody who wanted to broker peace. And in this case, it was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the judicial branch of the United States, John Jay, a Federalist that had actually been a part of writing the Federalist Papers during the ratification of the Constitution. The negotiation would eventually be accepted by the British, and the negotiation, what it led to, was that the British would remove their military from what is today the Ohio River Valley, which is the modern day states of Ohio, parts of Indiana, and northern Tennessee. But there would still be some trade restrictions that the United States would have when it came to trading with the French. Now, of course, this angered the French, but at this point in history, the French were not really at a stance in order to challenge what was going on. The following president was named John Adams. He, of course, was a Federalist as well, and he would be the first president that would only get a single term. George Washington served 2 terms as president, so 8 years, but John Adams only served 1, and that is because he was defeated by a Democratic Republican president named Thomas Jefferson. During the presidency of Thomas Jefferson, there were several important events that occurred. The first of these is a Supreme Court case called Marbury versus Madison, which occurred in 1803. This was an important case. It does not matter the semantics at this point, the results of which would be fundamental when it comes to the checks and balances system that we discussed last week. The Chief Justice at the time, John Marshall, was able, through this case, to establish a precedent, a principle of the Supreme Court known as judicial review. Through this court case, Chief Justice John Marshall ensured that the Supreme Court would have the ability from that day to the current day to decide if laws that were passed by Congress and accepted by the President followed the Constitution. And if the Supreme Court determined that they did not, they are actually able to make that law null and void. In other words, they are able to take that law and throw it in the trash can. Another thing that occurred during Thomas Jefferson's presidency is that the French offered the United States to buy a massive piece of territory that we today call the Louisiana Territory. We bought it for $15 million. And with this purchase, the size of our nation would nearly double. Now, this land would eventually be ventured through. However, the main point here that you need to be aware of is with this purchase, we gained access to New Orleans. New Orleans is at the mouth of what is called the Mississippi River, which runs almost the entirety of the vertical United States. This is essential for trade. Before we had railroads, before we had highways, before we had airplanes, this was essential. But you probably know that he did send 2 men, Lewis and Clark, to explore this land and map it and make contact with the native peoples that lived there. Following Thomas Jefferson's presidency, you would see the United States running into some big issues. The British continued to strong-arm our trade, seizing more American ships leading up into the 18-teens. And unfortunately, when the United States government declared an embargo, meaning that we would stop anybody trying to trade with the British, it would lead us getting involved in the second conflict of American history. It is called the War of 1812. It's funny they call it that because it lasted until 1814. And a lot of times this is referred to as the Second American Revolution. It is very similar to the First Revolution in that for much of it we are really just trying to hold our own. This would also be once Washington, D.C. was the established capital, and this would be the one and only time that a foreign power would actually make it into the White House and burn it to the ground. The White House that you see today in Washington, D.C. is a reconstruction of that original White House that the British burned down during the War of 1812. At the beginning of 1815, we were able to broker peace. However, there was a man in New Orleans that did not get word of this in time, still fighting a battle with the British, which he ultimately won. We will be talking about him in just a few moments. Before that, I would like for you to take about 60 or so seconds to discuss this question with a neighbor. What challenges did the new American government face in the early 1800s? Ready, go. So, obviously, other than having to deal with the failure of a first constitution, we did have to deal with quite a few skirmishes with the British, including an entire conflict that would span over 2 years. But overall, our democracy held on. Now, I mentioned there was a man at the end of the War of 1812 that would gain prominence in the upcoming years. That man was known as Andrew Jackson. He would gain more popularity after returning from war in the 1820s, and he would fundamentally alter the future of American politics. After the War of 1812, you would see about a 10-year period in which the political spectrum of the United States was pretty calm. This is commonly known as the era of good feeling, in which the Democratic Republican Party, which at this point would evolve into the Democratic Party, would more or less control politics unopposed. That was until the presidential election of 1824. In this election, Andrew Jackson would actually win the popular vote. He would earn the most amount of votes from everyday citizens in the election. However, he did not win a majority in the Electoral College, which is actually needed to win the presidency. This was a problem. There were three other candidates that were trying to win this election, and that is what led to none of them being able to gain a true majority. In the end, the House of Representatives would actually make the decision on the winner of this election, and it was very much swayed by old politics. The son of the second president, a man known as John Quincy Adams, would be elected to the presidency at this point. And just like his father, he would be one of the presidents that was only elected for one term. As Jackson would gain much support over the next 4 years, and in 1828, he would win the presidential election. In the end of this election, you would see a fracture among the now dominant Democratic Party. Most Southern Democrats would align with Jackson, whereas more Northern Democrats would splinter away and create a new political party represented by the owl known as the Whigs. Now, when we talk about Andrew Jackson's presidency, there were many different interesting events that would definitely shape the future. One of those is called the nullification crisis. This is one of the first instances in which you would really see a major conflict between the rights of the national federal government and the rights of state governments. This came about over tariffs, specifically trade taxes between the United States and foreign nations. One state in particular was very upset about tariffs placed on them on agricultural goods. This state was South Carolina, who termed these tariffs passed by Jackson's administration the tariffs of abomination. And they claimed that they had the ability to nullify or get rid of the law within their own borders. They claimed that states could ignore federal law. When Jackson signed this new tariff into law, South Carolina rejected it, and for the first time in American history, in 1828, a state threatened to leave the Union, the United States. The immediate response by Jackson's administration was to threaten to use military force to enforce these tariffs, leading to a crisis between the national government in Washington, D.C., and the government in South Carolina. In the end, Congress would pass a more compromised tariff, relieving some of the worries that the South Carolina state government had, but this would be a nail that would be very, very long in this coffin of the battle between state and federal power, as we will see this continue to culminate over the next 40 years leading up to the American Civil War. Another issue that came about during Jackson's presidency was something called the Indian Removal Act of 1830 that was supported by Southern Democrats within his party. This law aimed to remove Native Americans from lands in the South, specifically in Tennessee, North Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida, and relocate them to a territory above what is called the Republic of Texas. This would later become known as Oklahoma. Most of the people that were moved were not given a choice, and this land that was taken from them would later be sold to farmers. If they resisted, unfortunately, it would lead to the military coming in and a very bad situation. And there were some, specifically the Creek natives, that ended up in violent clashes when the US military was sent in to forcibly remove them. This also led to a 7-year war in Florida, in which the Seminole Indians would fight to more or less retain their land. But by 1838, all was lost, and unfortunately, the 15,000 Native Americans that were relocated to this territory in modern day Oklahoma would experience what is called as the Trail of Tears, in which about 4,000 of them unfortunately passed from disease, hunger, and exposure while being forcibly placed in these lands by the U.S. military. Now, this would obviously be a stain on Jackson's presidency, both then and now. And unfortunately, there really hasn't been a lot of retribution for these people, and even into the modern day. Another large issue that came about during Jackson's presidency deals with the National Bank. If you were not already aware, the national government has its own bank. At this time, it was filled with gold reserves and pretty much all the taxes that were collected from its citizens. Andrew Jackson and Southern Democrats, though, believed that this national bank only benefited northern states. And as a result, he forced the bank to close its doors momentarily. In 1832, he vetoed the renewal of the bank's charter, leading to the bank closing its doors for several years. Now, the Whig Party, the opposing party to Jackson, would challenge this, stating that his expansive power was making him very similar to somewhat of a king. And after re-election in 1832, unfortunately, it became very apparent to them that there was very little they could do to stop him. And unfortunately, all of the money in the national bank would be removed and distributed among state and private banks, particularly in the South, where his political party was prominent. Now, at the time, many supporters of Jackson and the Southern Democratic Party were very happy about this. However, it would actually lead to the probably second worst economic depression in American history, known as the Panic of 1837. He would actually already be out of the presidency at this point, and his predecessor would have to deal with it, and that man definitely got the bad end of that stick. So, the very last thing I would like for you to do today is to discuss this question using this image of the partner. How was the national bank involved in our economy prior to Jackson's closure of it? So it's probably pretty obvious that the national bank definitely played a key role in our economy. Not only did it possess the money that we collected in taxes, but it also paid off our bills to foreign nations and large business owners. It controlled state banks to make sure that they had a steady supply of currency that could be distributed to Americans. It kept our economy stable. It definitely allowed for loans to be taken out, and that obviously would assist not just Americans but also the government with interest. And overall, it did have a positive influence. However, of course, there were many people that did argue that it favored certain states over others. Overall, though, the National Bank would return in the 1840s and it would play many similar roles. All right, with that being said, that is going to be all for our lesson today. As a reminder, once again, your presidential poster project is due today. The due date is 3:15 p.m. Please make sure that you are trying to get that in by then. And don't forget about your exit ticket at the end of class.